One of the most fun experiences I have had as a father is to get to show my children all the things that I thought were super cool when I was a kid. And to see them get to discover things for the first time. And when I was a kid, I was born in 1976. My childhood was firmly ensconced in the 80s. And so Star Wars was a pretty big deal. I know it's not such a big deal anymore and people don't talk about it ever. But when I was a kid, of course, it was a big deal. And because of that, it's a little bit hard for us to remember with all of the Star Wars movies we've had since that time, with all the TV shows, with all the cartoons, with all the stuff. It is sometimes hard to remember that one of the most shocking moments in movie history came on May 21st, 1980. Now, that was when the movie The Empire Strikes Back was released to the public, the sequel to Star Wars. And Star Wars was not supposed to be a big hit when it came on the scene in 1977. In fact, most of the actors that were involved thought it was going to be a complete disaster. Sir Alec Guinness, who played Obi-Wan Kenobi, famously wrote to all of his friends that the movie was trash. But because he was British, he said it was rubbish. Same thing. It turns out, however, that the film was not rubbish. It was a classic tale of good versus evil, the underdogs versus the evil empire, and it touched on something in our country that people really loved to see. And it introduced us to characters that became iconic each in their own right. Luke, the orphaned hero, Leia, the rebel leader, Han, the space pirate, Chewie, the walking and growling carpet, and of course, Darth Vader. Darth Vader breathed in an evil way. He was the bad guy, and it didn't take a great deal of insight to figure that out. Everything about him, his voice, his costume, his special powers, screamed villain. There are a bunch of videos that go around on YouTube and Reddit, all these different things. And one of my favorite things is a dog watching Star Wars for the first time. And when Darth Vader, they board the ship and they come in and they take out the door and Darth Vader walks through, the dog runs and hides. It is evident that Darth Vader is the bad guy. Now, the film, which had a budget of around $11 million, earned a worldwide box office revenue of around $775 million that first go-around. Of course, it's been released like 4 more times since then. And by the way, Han shot first. Just want to clear that up. It also won several film awards, including 10 Academy Award, and had 10 Academy Award nominations. So, when Empire came out, the world was excited. They knew what the story was about. They couldn't wait to see what was going to happen next. It was a really, really big deal. And if you've seen The Empire Strikes Back, if you haven't and you feel like I'm going to spoil something for you, people, let me just say, this was 45 years ago, all right? So if you don't know this by now and you're not under the age of 10, that's not my fault, okay? So, getting back to it, Darth Vader had captured Han and Leia and Chewie. Luke was training with Yoda, and he went to save them and ended up in a fight with Darth Vader. And it was in this scene right here that it happened. The shocking reveal. And it was in this moment where Darth Vader told not just Luke, but the entire world something that they did not know. Vader says, Obi-Wan never told you what happened to your father. Luke says, he told me enough. He told me you killed him. And Vader says, you're wrong. Did you know that? Somehow in culture, we have decided that at this point, Darth Vader said, Luke, I am your father. That is incorrect. He says, no, I am your father. Now, I can only imagine, because I was only 4 years old at the time, that there was a gasping in the crowd when he said those words. Shock at the twist that they never saw coming. How could it be that this big evil villain is the supposedly dead father of the movie's hero? And from that moment on, the story you thought you had been watching changed. That little piece of information, that one line, changed the entire narrative. And this is what, of course, makes a great twist in any story. It changes the way you understand the whole. And if the twist is really good, you have to go back and watch or read or listen to things again to see what you missed, right? Because now the entire thing has changed and you see it with new eyes, hear it with new ears. Everything has new meaning. Everything has new context. Now, in our study of the book of John, we have reached the last week of Jesus' life. And while in the other Gospels, every day of Jesus' last week is filled with purposeful events from Sunday all the way through Thursday and Friday, in John, the story is, in fact, different. We read about the celebration of Jesus entering Jerusalem. There is a little bit of conversation that happens after it, and then boom, we're at Thursday. We skip all the other days of the week, apparently. But here we are on Thursday, and Thursday is the day when Jesus had the Last Supper with his disciples before he went out to pray, which led to his arrest, which led to the cross. But the experience in the book of John is very different. Even that last moment, even that Last Supper, even the things that happened there are very different than what happened in the other Gospels. And John, in John chapter 13, gives us an event which helps us to understand Jesus, his life, and yes, his death, in a way that we might not have otherwise. And this event tells us what Jesus is about. It draws us into his mindset, and it reveals to us a deep and enduring mystery about who he is and what he is about. And while we might rightfully look to the cross and the resurrection as the turning point in the story, which, of course, it is, this moment in John chapter 13 holds great, great significance if we are going to grasp what actually happens in the cross and the resurrection. So if you have your Bibles, open up to John chapter 13. And it's kind of funny because we are so used to this story, so accustomed to this story. It's such a part of our biblical Jesus language that we probably don't realize it's not in all the other Gospels as well. But here it is, just in the book of John. So let's start in verses 1 through 3 with the premise of this event. Starting in verse 1. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. Okay, now, this is quite the premise, and we need to pay attention to it because it sets the stage in a different and kind of more dramatic way than we've seen other things open and develop within the Gospel of John. And it's a wonderful introduction to this chapter, which in these moments tells us what is going to happen, and furthermore, how we should read this account, what we should be looking for as we go through this story. So what is the story about according to these verses? It's about Jesus and his love for his disciples. He knew that his time was coming to an end, which we know means what? The cross. He's going to die. He knew that the cross was right around the corner. And John makes clear to say this. He loved them while they were in the world, and in fact, he loved them until when? The end. This is a love story. Everything that Jesus has done up to this point has been because he loves. And specifically, John points out here, he loves his disciples, he loves his followers. And all that Jesus will do from this point in the story forward is going to be because of his great love. This is how we are to understand this passage. This is a story about love. So they were having dinner together. And this dinner was different than the normal dinner. Why was it different? Well, it was part of the Passover. And I know here in verse 1, he says it was just before the Passover. In the other Gospels, it is actually the first meal of the Passover. And we should view these as the same thing, that this is all part of the Passover cycle and festival. All the Gospel writers want this event, this meal, to be associated with the Passover feast. This is really important to all of them. And the reason why is that the Passover was the celebration of God delivering his people from slavery in Egypt. And one of the most crucial elements of the Passover, and particularly the first event, was the sacrifice of the lamb, whose blood was then put over the doorway of the home of the people, the homes of the people of God. And when the angel of death came on the scene and it saw the blood of the lamb on their doors, what did it do? It passed over. And so their firstborn was not taken, while the firstborn of those who did not have this blood on their door, they lost the lives of their firstborn. The lamb died, the blood was spread, salvation occurred. And so in all the Gospels, they want this moment to be associated with that moment because Jesus is the sacrificial lamb. His blood will be spilled, and through his blood, salvation comes. So this is the scene. But in this particular moment, it is only Jesus and his disciples who are present. But they are not the only ones who are active in this story because we have a new character. Someone new is on the scene who is part of what is making things happen. And this new character is the real enemy. The one who has been behind the scenes all this time. And this enemy is the devil. Now, this is not actually his first appearance in the Gospel of John. He was briefly mentioned back in chapter 12, verse 31, where Jesus says, "Now is the time for judgment of this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out." Again, speaking about his crucifixion and about the putting down of this enemy. And Jesus was trying to explain in that moment that he was going to die for the world and that his death would defeat the power of this world. But here in chapter 13, the devil is named. He is an active part of this story, and he has shown up in particular to make sure that something happens. He prompted Judas to do what? To betray Jesus. We'll get to some of that later. Why does Judas actually need to betray Jesus when all he really does is show up and say, "This is the guy," right? It's a little strange, to me at least in context, but this is what the devil has prompted him to do. And of course, the betrayal leads to his crucifixion, which leads to his death, which leads to his resurrection. Everything is rolling that direction, and John makes no secret of it, because Jesus knows that's the way it's going, and he is the one we're following through the story. Now, we need to note that John does not intend for this to be an excuse for Judas. If you remember back at the beginning of chapter 12 when Jesus was anointed, John tells us very clearly what he thought about Judas. When Judas said this perfume was too expensive, it shouldn't have been spent on this moment, it should have been given to the poor, John makes sure we know that Judas wasn't a good guy. He was, in fact, a bad guy who just had been stealing from the treasury, and he didn't want this money to be spent on Jesus because he wanted it for himself. So in this point in the story, he's even more vilified because he has graduated from a thief to the person we're going to call the devil man, the one who is under the influence of the devil. And that makes him unique because who else is under the direct influence of the devil in the Gospel of John? It's him, right? It's him. He's the guy. But verse 3 makes sure that we don't get confused as to what's going on. Because this story is not about the influence of the devil or the actions of Judas. That's not what this is about. Judas is not in control of what happens. The devil is not in control of what happens. Instead, who is in control, according to verse 3? The Father, but more directly, Jesus is. Because all power has been given to him. Therefore, whatever happens in the rest of this story happens under the direct decision and influence of Jesus Christ. No one else, nothing else. That's a pretty big statement, isn't it? Now we know, because Jesus has gone to great pains to tell us, that everything he's doing comes from the direction of the Father. But this tells us that everything that happens, Jesus will do in full power. He is making the decisions. He is playing the plays that he wants to make. He is in complete control. And we need to wrap our minds around that because it is this point which makes the story so shocking. Jesus has the full power of God at his disposal. This is how the story starts. He loves. He's going to continue to love. There are forces that are at work, but Jesus is in full control. So, if you were God-man, and you were sitting across from devil-man, who you know was going to devil you, what would you do? Let's look at the act itself, starting in verse 4. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Okay, we need to start this with the basic premise that we understand and yet we don't. So let's make this painfully clear. Washing someone else's feet is gross. I love all of you. I'm willing to serve you in many ways. But touching your feet would be an act of great sacrifice on my part. Do you know why? I don't want to do it. I don't. I don't want to touch them. I don't want to smell them. I don't want to clean whatever is going on down there with that situation. I want nothing to do with it. And I am not alone in feeling this way. Jesus had all power and authority, but instead of basking in the glow of power and authority, Jesus emptied or humbled himself and adopted the form, the posture or role of a servant. And how thoroughly does he adopt this form? He does it as thoroughly as is possible for him. Now, touching feet was regarded as menial slave work, and as such was primarily an assignment given to Gentile slaves and women. And I'm sorry to say this within this context, I know. I didn't make the rules. I don't believe that those things are right. But you gave it to the slaves you respected the least. Or the slaves within, those who were all serving, it was given to the one that all the slaves respected the least. This was the entry-level job, and it was entry-level for a good reason. People's feet were very dirty. Why? Well, they were walking around in dirt all the time with sandals, walking down streets where animals have gone to the bathroom repeatedly. It is gross. I don't think I need to continue. I think you get the idea of what I'm talking about. And so I'll just stop there, except you. Now, students were responsible to rabbis or teachers to perform menial tasks of labor, but even this, for them, would have been considered over the line. And we have to remember that this is a society that was very conscious of status symbols, of shame and honor. And so touching or washing of feet it wasn't something that anyone with any honor or self-respect or that someone cared for would do. And maybe you remember all the way back to the beginning of the book of John, when John the Baptist sees Jesus, and he knows that he's the Lamb of God. Do you remember what John says? I am not worthy enough to untie his sandals. So in that moment, John is saying, I see the Son of God, and I'm not even good enough to touch his shoes. There is a servant above me who could do that. I'm not even worthy of that, which he's basically saying, I am below the lowest. But here, that lowly servant is the Son of God himself. And John makes it clear that Jesus intended that he should be viewed as the lowest of servants. He's not stumbling into this example. And how do we know that? How do we know that he intended this application? Well, what does he do with his clothing? He takes it off and he lays it down. Now that's an interesting word, right? Because where are we most accustomed to hearing Jesus lay something down? What is that usually referring to? His life, that he is giving it up on our behalf. But in this case, he takes off his clothes and he lays his clothes down. And then he tied a towel around himself in the fashion of a slave and goes around crawling on the floor, washing their feet and wiping their feet with the towel that he's wearing as his clothing. This is not just humbling oneself. It is an intentional dishonoring of oneself, demonstrably putting himself in the lowest position any of them in the room could understand, and making sure that there was no confusion as to what he was doing. Furthermore, to make things more awkward, they didn't sit in chairs around the table like we do. The table would have been low to the ground, and they would have been reclining at the table. Meaning that if the table were here, their bodies would have been leaned this way, with their feet sticking out away from the table. Which meant that as Jesus made his way around the circle, their eyes are in direct level with one another. They're not looking down on him. He's sitting at their feet, looking at them looking at him as he washes their feet. Now, normally, if a servant were doing that, where would your attention be? Back at the table. You're over here, they're down here, doing their thing to your feet. But this is Jesus. Can you imagine how the first person he went to felt? As Jesus is there in front of him, and he's looking him directly in the eye, and Jesus is washing his feet. This leads to a response with Peter, who is shocked and indignant about what is going on, because this is not right. From verses 6 through 9, He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." And it's this verse I want you to remember. Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Now, it's not as clear in the Gospel of John as it is in the other Gospels, but Peter is a bit of a talk first, think later kind of guy. He's the one that jumps into the water to walk on water without thinking about if he could actually walk on water. And once he gets out there and he's walking on water and he realizes I'm walking on water, what does he do? He sinks, because this man talks or acts before he thinks. But we need to give him a little bit of credit here, because this response is not inappropriate at all. This is, in fact, the appropriate response. He may not understand everything about Jesus, but he certainly understands that if anyone in this scenario should be washing someone else's feet, he should be washing Jesus' feet. This was not right by any stretch of the imagination. The Son of God should not be doing this thing, whether he chose to do it or not. It's wrong. And Peter said what he should have said. We need his comments in this story. We really do. But while it was not the inappropriate response, it was the wrong response, given what Jesus was trying to teach them. And what does Jesus ultimately say to him? You don't get it, but you will. And when Peter continues to protest, he says, look, if you refuse to let me do this, then you just need to get out. It's a little harsh, isn't it? Yeah, feels that way. I mean, Peter's just trying to do what's right. He's just trying to honor Jesus. He's just trying to, in some ways, even promote his belief in who Jesus is and Peter's position in relation to him. But Jesus says, if you don't let me do this for you, then you can have nothing to do with me. We're going to come back to that at the end. But this exchange is an important one in the narrative. Because what is Jesus telling him? There is an essential part to the story of Jesus that Jesus understands, but none of his followers do. And we've talked about this in recent weeks, where we've said that something is the cross, that something is the resurrection, and that's true. In all of those cases, it's the cross and the resurrection, but in this case, it's something different. He's not talking about the cross and the resurrection. He's talking about right now. You need to let me do this for you. Right now. And if you can't let me serve you, then you're out. The problem is that Peter doesn't understand what kind of story he is in. He thinks he's in a different story. He thinks he's in the story of the Son of God who has come to earth to save his people with great power, which he is in that story, but he also isn't. They then, his disciples, are his faithful followers, his servants, and their job is to go with him, serve him, treat him like the king he is, which that's also true. But it's also not the story. Are they wrong about is Peter wrong about any of these dynamics? No. The Son of God has come to save his people with great power. They are there to follow him, to listen, and to serve. They are less than him. But the story is not about how well they serve him. It is about how he, the Son of God, serves the people he loves. Jesus has come, you see, to love, to serve, and to sacrifice. He has not come that we might better serve him. He has not come to walk down the street that we all might say, Hosanna and Lord, Lord. That is not why he is here. He has come because humbling himself and serving us is the only way we will ever find life. And if finding life was dependent upon us serving him better, well, that's a different story. God, through Jesus, is the author of this story, and it is a story unlike any that has ever been told. So Peter, hearing all these words, says, well, then wash all of me. Love the enthusiasm. Missing the point. What is the point? The point is what Jesus is actually about, and therefore what we are about. From verses 10 through 17. Jesus answered, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash whose feet? One another's feet. Not his, one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. Now, some important things we need to note as we're sort of coming around the corner here on this story. Number one, Jesus includes everyone in his act of love and service. There is no earning this moment in the story. There's not even the sense of Jesus trying to honor them or raise them up. This is a moment of pure service. And how do we know that's true? Well, Judas was in the room, and Jesus washed his feet, knowing that Judas was going to betray him. He chose to serve the one who would help facilitate his death. And this is absurd in any circumstances, let alone the Son of God doing it for the one who is going to betray him. But friends, isn't that the gospel? They don't understand what is going on, but Jesus wants them to know. In whatever way they can wrap their minds around this. And I don't read this moment as a moment of frustration, but a moment where Jesus is laid bare and he showed them in the best, most demonstrative way possible what he is actually about. You call me teacher and Lord. I am teacher and Lord. But the one above you has intentionally, with great humility, served you in the most debasing way possible. So guess what this means for you? No servant is greater than his master. If I have done this for you and you want to be like me, then you will do what I have done. And I am so convicted by the fact that he doesn't say, so wash my feet. He says, wash the feet of whom? Of each other. Which means what? There is no one alive that the disciple of Jesus should not lovingly, sacrificially, and humiliatingly serve. No one. This message is repeated in the other Gospels just in a different way, from Mark chapter 10, verses 42 through 45. Again, sort of in a similar moment in the timeline for Mark. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Make no mistake, John wanted his readers to understand that the death of Jesus was no accident pushed by outside forces. But the sacrifice of the Lamb of God was God's means of serving the world. His Son was sacrificed intentionally to save us from our sin. The only one who could do it did it on our behalf. And this was the plan, because it could happen no other way. I have a tough but honest question, which I want us to wrestle with a little bit here as we close. Why would God bother? In a room where the worst of humanity is represented, in one who is stolen, in one who wants to take away from Jesus' followers, in one who is going to sell Jesus out for money, Jesus gets down and washes that person's feet. And it's easy for us to stand outside and look at Judas and say, well, Judas did not deserve that kind of treatment. And then we can maybe stand back and, well, would I treat my betrayer that way and go that route? But the fact of the matter is that we are more like Judas than we are like anyone else in the story. At times we're like Peter. At times we're like those who are not named, but there is an element of Judas to all of us. We do not deserve to be loved this way. And we certainly do not deserve to be served by the God who made us. Why would God bother with me? But this is the truth of our story. It is the uncomfortable knowledge of this truth that, in fact, makes us who we are. Because let's circle back to the one most important line in this whole thing. If you don't let me do this for you, you can't be a part of what I'm doing. Why is that so significant? Why is that the identifier that I want us to acknowledge here today? I acknowledge that because it's a little bit silly for me to stand in front of you and pretend that I can put God in front of myself all the time. It's a little bit silly for me to identify, well, God, in this moment, I'm going to serve you. In complete humility and praise, I am going to give all this up to you, when the one who is serving me says, really? That's what you're going to do? That's who you are? Jesus moves his way around this circle knowing that everyone there was going to choose themselves and do it often. He also knows that we are going to have some pretty severe issues putting other people below ourselves. particularly if we have to humble ourselves in a way that we don't want to. Hear me out. We can humble ourselves in a lot of different ways, right? But all of us have a line. We all have a line where humbling in our minds shifts to humiliation. Well, I have to have some sense of pride. I have to stick up for myself. I can't just let this person walk all over me. If I do this, then what am I teaching them? How are they going to learn this or that? And what did Jesus do to all of those arguments we carry around inside of us? He made sure we had no excuse. You think it's bad for you? I washed the dirty feet of the guy who was selling me out in real time. What is it you can't do? Tell me again. Tell me how you can't serve this person. Tell me how you can't love this person. And then tell me how you want to be like me, but you just can't. Look, there were many things Jesus did that his disciples could in fact not do. And even with the power of the Holy Spirit later in the story, they still couldn't do it like Jesus. Fair? They couldn't teach like he did. They did not have the same power that he did. They did not have the authority that Jesus had. They could not die for the salvation of the world. But no matter the circumstances or scenario, the one thing they could always do to be the most like Jesus was wash the feet of others. The one thing they could do in any circumstance, any scenario, any time, place, person, or situation was humbly, lovingly serve that person. Kingdom ethics dictate that it is not the amount of power or authority that you have that shows you are a child of the living God. And shame on us when we pretend that it is some sort of authority we have that makes us better than others. I'm starting to preach a little bit, but I don't think I need a towel. The proof is found in your willingness to humble yourself and serve others, and not in a way that is comfortable, but in a way that puts the most basic and even gross needs of others in front of your own, in a way that tells them, I see you as you are, and I love you, and I serve you. And you don't have to wash your own feet before you come to me. I'll do that for you. This is what it means to live like Jesus. There's no foot too dirty for us to get down on the ground and wash, because we are never, ever more like Jesus than when we strip ourselves bare, lower ourselves in front of someone else, and show them, not just with words, but with our deeds, that they matter to us. Amen?